Today, our political reality is that people of color are being further marginalized and made to feel more other than ever in our recent history. We're at a seminal moment in our history when our society is finally waking up to and taking action about the abuse of the women have been enduring for so many years. So our celebration of Korean American women authors this evening seems incredibly timely and important. And I'm glad that all of you are here to experience it together. So welcome. My name is H.J. Lee, and I'm the president of Korean American Story. Thank you. For those of you that may not know, our mission is to capture, create, share, and preserve the stories of the Korean American experience by supporting and promoting storytelling in all forms that explore and reflect the ever-evolving Korean American story. We do this to bridge gaps between communities and to instill cultural awareness and pride among the Korean American community. I would like to thank the authors for making time in their busy schedules to be here. I want to thank the volunteers and the board members who made this event possible. I want to thank Hwayo for bringing their soju here to make sure that you're nice and warm on this cold evening. I was first introduced to Hwayo at Jongno Barbecue, and after many bottles, I could tell you it's the best soju. And finally, I want to thank a couple of more people. One is Unju for making the beautiful graphic that you see everywhere. Woo! And the final thanks goes to Professor Minsoo Kang, who originally thought of this idea and pitched it to me and has been instrumental in putting this event together. So really, thank you for that. And the last thing I want to say is I'd like you to consider making a donation to Korean American Story so that we could continue to organize more events like this. And we have still some books left, so if you get a chance after the program, go take a look and see if you could purchase some books. The authors would be happy to sign it for you. So with that, I want to invite Vivian Lee, who is the News One anchor, but more importantly, she's our board member, to take away.
Thanks, HJ. Welcome, everyone. We filled the room. That's awesome. Thank you so much for coming, but I also understand that this was an incredible opportunity to meet some wonderful writers. I'd like to ask all of our authors to come up on stage right now. And if you can go in alphabetical order, that would be great. Actually, I'm going to take that seat. And there's like water for each of you down by your feet. Sorry, we don't have tables, but at least you have something for wetting the lips. So as HJ said, it is a very timely moment for us to, I guess, reinforce the need to tell our stories and to look at the many layers of identity and to celebrate them. And I wanted to, first of all, introduce the person who, with HJ, helped to spark this idea, Minsoo Kang, standing right behind me in his very humble way. And then I'll give you a brief bio of each of our writers that we're featuring tonight. Minsoo Kang, sorry, my back is to you, is a professor of history, a writer, and a translator. He's the author of the history book Sublime Dreams of Living Machines, the Automaton in the European Imagination. He teaches at the University of Missouri St. Louis. He once served in the South Korean Army. He earned his PhD in European history at UCLA, so you can see he has a dearth of things to do. Patty Yumi Cottrell is the author of Sorry to Disrupt the Peace. She lives in New York. Jimin Han was born in Seoul, Korea, and grew up in New York, Rhode Island, and Ohio. She attended Cornell University and Sarah Lawrence College. Her writing can be found online at NPR's Weekend Magazine, Poets and Writers Magazine, Entropy, The Rumpus, Hyphen Magazine, among others. She teaches at the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College. Jin Lee's Pachinko, oh, I'm sorry, I should mention that she is the author of, I'm sorry, A Small Revolution. Jin Lee Pachinko is a national bestseller, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and an American Booksellers Association's Indie Next Great Reads. Pachinko is her second book, and she was a finalist for the National Book Awards. Yoojin Grace Wuertz was born in Seoul, South Korea, and she immigrated to the United States at the age of 6. She holds a BA in English from Yale University and an MFA in fiction from New York University. Everything Belongs to Us is her debut novel, which was selected as a New York Times Editor's Choice and longlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize. And finally, last but not least, Chong Yoon was born in Seoul, South Korea, and grew up in Fargo, North Dakota. So many knowing giggles there, Chong. What's going on? Her debut novel, Shelter, published by Picador in 2016, was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, too, and was a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Award. So welcome to all of our writers. Thank you very much for joining us. And before we begin with short storytelling, because we asked all of our writers to help us take this in a different direction from your conventional authors gathering, writers gathering. We wanted all of them to talk and share something personal about themselves with you. But before we do that, I'm going to ask Minsoo to come up and say a few words about the significance of our gathering tonight. Minsoo?
Excuse me if I'm a little loud. I'm used to lecturing to 60 undergrads in a big lecture hall, so I'll try not to do that. In fact, I'll just... Right. My central purpose coming up here is to really urge you to read all 5 novels. If in a row, if you can, because I have, and they're freaking awesome, every single one of them, right? I did suggest this to HJ. And it really helped that when I read all 5 of them, none of them sucked, right? They were really, really wonderful. But I'm about to give you an additional good reason why you should read all 5, not just 1 or 2 or 3, and they should all buy at least one. So as Vivian said, my day job is as a historian. So in addition to reading novels as an avid reader of literature, I can't help thinking in historical terms as well. And also as a cultural and intellectual historian, when I look at periods of time that are particularly known for great outpouring of culture and literature, whether we're talking about drama during the time of ancient Athens or Italian Renaissance or even Korea during the colonial period in the 1920s when the first generation of modern Korean novelists produced incredible works. The thing that really strikes out at me is not only the high quality of the works being produced, but the sheer variety of them. Right? In fact, what these sort of commissars of literary taste, who are always trying to say all literature should be written this way or that way, what they don't understand is that it is the variety and the competition among these kinds of voices that makes a great culture. That in fact, if you look at a culture where there was the dominance of one type of genre, one type of writing, it usually means something terribly has gone wrong in that country. This is Russia under Stalin, when it's all social realism, or some kind of a fascistic nationalist state where it all has to be correct in terms of the national identity and so on, right? Now, what I'm about to tell you is that 5 novels, if you read all 5 of them even in a row, if you just take 2 months off and you're going to read completely unique voices, right? You're never going to be bored. You're never going to go, oh, this is good, but it's good in the way that the last one was good, and so on, right? And I just want to give you very briefly just a taste of what what you'll experience when you if you do decide to take on the task. And as I said, we're here to celebrate Asian American writing, but also more specifically Korean American writing, and also even more specifically Korean American women's writing. And to me, the sign of its health is in the variety, right? That the fact that these aren't 5 good novels that are all good in similar ways, right? So, in no specific order, Jin Lee's Pachinko, right? Great achievement as a finalist for the National Book Award. Epic, generational work, right? She really took on a whale of a subject. There are writers who could be described as really good fly fishermen, just getting the specific, and then there are whale hunters, and she took on a big topic, right? The long untold story of ethnic Koreans in Japan, right? Starts during the colonial era, and it goes through up to our own period of what these people, despised minority in Japan, had to go through. And oftentimes, with her previous best-selling novel, Free Food for Millionaires, so often that novel has been described as Dickensian, referring to its scope, its size, and its willingness to take on big subject. This one, she tops it, right? She, as I said, she went after a whale, and this epic historical story that spanned decades and decades, it was just fantastic. And all the awards and recognition she got, I think she fully deserved it, right? Okay, Yoojin Grace Wuertz is Everything Belonged to Us. Again, very different. The entire novel takes place in South Korea during the last years of the dictator Park Chung-hee's presidency. Right, right before he was assassinated in '79, I'm reluctant to call it an allegory because usually novel as allegories, the characters tend to be very flat, right? Because they just symbolize something. And these characters were not flat. These were fully realized human beings, but it does have an allegorical function in the best sense of the word because it is about a friendship among three people. A girl from one of the richest chaebol corporations in Korea, a boy from a middle-class family, and another girl from one of the poorest stratum of that society. Right? And even during the worst time of the dictatorship, one of the ideology of the defense of the society was what was called educational meritocracy. Right? No matter how poor you are, powerless you are, you study really hard, you get to Seoul National University, and then your future is bright, right? And these three students, young people, meet there. They made it to Seoul National University. And then she exposes sort of the lie behind their promise, because it's not, you don't get there and everything's, well. It's like, for instance, the boy realized that now in the next 4 years in college, he has to, work to network so that his future can be set with all these people that he met. And also, it's a rather tragic story of a doomed friendship because that makes lie out of that notion of educational meritocracy because they come from very different parts of the society and it's not all going to work. And just human empathy itself is not enough. And it's just a fantastic depiction of Korea at that one specific moment. And just to say that the characters are not flat, I feel that I've known all three of these people. I felt that I met all three of them at one point or another, right? And Jimin Han's A Small Revolution, that also takes in a different time period, a very different kind of novel. It takes place in both South Korea and a college in Pennsylvania, a fictional college, in the 1980s. And it begins with a shocking situation of a gunman who walks into a university, unfortunately something that we're all too familiar with these days, takes a couple of people hostage, and then the story treads back to see where all of this has begun. And it begins with something a lot of Korean Americans are familiar with, which, after you graduate from high school, sometimes your parents force you to go back to Korea, right, to take Korean language courses, and so that you don't completely forget what that's like, right? And there's this wonderful depiction of being Korean, but not being Korean, right? And that sense of alienation of being at a place now where everybody do look like you, but you don't really speak their language, and the cultures you have to get used to. And the kind of maelstrom that they get involved, because this is, after all, in the 1980s, pre-democracy, and what the experiences of these Korean Americans go through in the so-called native country, it sets the background for what's going to eventually happen in this tragic incident in Pennsylvania a couple of years back, right? Fascinating, right? Okay. You got to get this novel. It's awesome, right? All three of them. Right. And then with Chong Yoon's Shelter, I told her just now that I call this novel a gut puncher, which is one of the highest compliments that I can give to a novel, right? I don't like novels that just tickle me or pat me on the back. I want to get hurt, right? So when it comes to, like, especially I tell my friends, when it comes to 19th century novels, I'm fine with the Victorians, Dickens, Eliot, they're all great, right? But I just prefer the Russians and the French because they just, I mean, nobody punches you like Dostoevsky and Zola, right? This is a gut puncher, right? And the story takes entirely in the United States, in an upscale town near Boston, right? And it begins with just a description of a horrific crime that gets visited on an aging Korean-American couple. And this brings in their estranged son, who's had a very problematic relationship with their parents. And but what was really fascinating is that, so you think it's about just a crime, but the monstrous crime itself ends up revealing something even monstrous that has been there all along. And it was I thought that it was such a gutsy thing that what Jung Yun did is to take on a topic that's, for Korean Americans, is supposed to be really sacrosanct, which is the family, right? I mean, all the secrets and abuses and the toxic nature of dysfunctional family that you're not supposed to talk about, right? You're supposed to respect your parents, right? But it's all right there, and it's gripping in a way that, yeah, it punched me, but I just couldn't let it go. So I just sort of urge you. So already so far, I mean, these are all completely different novels, and also Patty Yumi Cottrell's wonderful novel. It is strange and unusual, but again, coming from me, that's a huge compliment. Right? And it's also a significant contribution to the literature of Korean American adoptee experience. A young woman who's an adoptee, who has an American name, who lives in New York, has to go back to her original hometown in the Midwest because her brother committed suicide, and her brother is also an adoptee, but not by blood. So her white parents adopted two different, Korean American children, right? But what was just really remarkable about this is that each chapter is like this complete thwarting of cliches, of this temptation to sentimentality, of going back home, reconnecting with people, and so on, because you don't always know why she's reacting the way she does. And at some point you realize, I mean, are we all? Is there all standard way in which we're supposed to mourn and we're supposed to retread our past, or is there something about, especially a tragic death, that is inherently an estranging experience? So the novel carries you along in terms of the main character's actions, but at the end, you're not really supposed to know why she does the things that she does. And that's so close to real life. To the extent that I would say in the most positive way possible, it reminded me really of the great existentialist novels of Camus and such, where you see the situation, but it is almost a fantasy to realize that there's going to be sort of revelatory moment where everything just gets worked out, because that's not life, that's not reality, right? With this, I hope my brief presentation of what these novels are about were helpful to you in urging you to read all 5 of them in a row. And I promise you're not going to be bored. All of them are just going to completely entrance you in different ways. And the one thing that I don't have the time to talk about is how excellent their writing is. The only way I could do that is to read paragraphs and say, see, it's awesome, right? Right? So the last thing I want to say before I go is that when HJ and I talked about putting on this event, I was really reluctant to take on this role that I'm playing right now, because we are celebrating Korean American women's writing, and I don't want to be accused of mansplaining, right? And I was sort of reluctant. I said somebody else should do it and all that. But I had a series of exchanges with Minjin, and she pointed out that one good reason I should do it is that there's sort of cliche about Asian American men being either uninterested or outright hostile to women's issues. So this may be a way in which I will break that stereotype, right? And I was really moved by what Minjin had to say. So considering that, it's time for me to shut the hell up and let the women speak.
Thank you, Minsoo. I couldn't think of anyone better to take on that role. So I'm going to sit down. I think we're all going to get a little more comfortable. We're now going to open it up to each writer to talk about her own experiences in her own way. We did not put out a theme there. We just asked each author to pick the subject that she wanted to talk about. So we're going to start with Patty, and take it away.
Okay, right here?
Right here,
okay,
right now.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So this morning I was trying to decide what to talk about because the story is supposed to be personal. So I had two options. One was to talk about my biological family in Korea, and then the other option was to talk about Fiona Apple. So I chose Fiona Apple. So I'm assuming you know who Fiona Apple is. So that's a good place to start. So I'm just going to read a little bit. This is something that I wrote about Fiona Apple. When I was 17 years old, I was obsessed with Fiona Apple. This obsession was more real to me than anything or anyone in my actual life. Growing up as a Korean adoptee in the suburbs of Milwaukee, I felt distant from my white adoptive parents and my two younger brothers, who were also Korean adoptees. My brothers were from different biological families, and the three of us looked nothing alike. We were all disgusting in different ways. This was the only beautiful thing about us. I looked at my family in a detached way, the way a person who dislikes plants would look at plants. For many years, perhaps 5 to 10, I felt nothing for them, and I reserved all of my joy, happiness, and dread for my obsession with Fiona Apple. The world appears brighter and sharper when you're in the midst of an obsession. Obsession can feel powerful, overwhelming, and really fucking sad. When you're obsessed with someone, you're almost impossible to locate. You're sucked down into the abyss. It was 1998. I would come across Fiona Apple's photo in a magazine at a store and start squealing. Then I would tuck the magazine into the waist of my pants and walk out of the store. When I read mean message board comments about her physical appearance, it felt like an attack on my very own self, and I would go into the bathroom and force myself to puke. I never thought I had an eating disorder because I was skinny. I thought eating disorders were for overweight people. I was so mean and hateful, I had no compassion for anyone. It was a particular form of hell to feel everything in my life so intensely through the void of this person I would never know. Do you think that you're maybe a lesbian? My mother asked me. She was standing in my teenage bedroom and glancing around at everything. 2 Fiona Apple posters were pinned to the walls, one of Fiona Apple in her underwear from the Criminal video, and the other a giant poster of Fiona Apple gripping a microphone. I was adult enough to admit that from far away, the microphone looked like a penis. Oh my God, I said to my mother, I just love Fiona Apple. It's not about sex or something. She's really talented and she's almost my age. My mother looked at me. Well, don't you think you're talented too? What I said about Fiona Apple didn't make sense to her. I wanted to cry, tears of frustration, whenever I talked to my mother, because she wasn't Fiona Apple. And why was she, my mother, this non-Fiona Apple entity, talking to me and wasting my time when I could be imagining talking with Fiona Apple? It was sad. I would rather talk to my idea of a person, a fantasy ghost person that existed only in my imagination, than talk with my own parents. Throughout this time of obsession, I would casually mention Fiona Apple many times throughout the day as if I knew her, as if we were best friends. Oh, Fiona likes that. Fiona is a vegetarian. That reminds me of Fiona. Fiona's song, Fiona's album. Fiona wore that. Fiona said. Fiona's tour. A picture of Fiona. Fiona Apple riding the subway. Fiona's OCD. Fiona's drugs. Fiona's real last name. In 2006, I went to Fiona Apple's show in Milwaukee. I had brought a plastic bag of weed with me, mostly shake. I remembered that in 1999, Fiona Apple stayed at the Hyatt downtown. I don't even know how I knew this, but 7 years after I'd first acquired that knowledge, I decided to ride my bike there after her show. Her tour bus was parked in front of the hotel entrance. Fiona Apple was standing outside of it, hugging her bandmates, teary-eyed. It was the last show of her tour. I waited, and when there was an opening, I approached her. I imagined we would go onto her tour bus and smoke up together. Possibly, we would have a deep conversation. Perhaps we would fall in love. We would understand each other, I was certain. As I approached her, a look of confusion came across her face. It became obvious she wondered what I was doing and why I was there. I held up the bag of weed in front of her face. "Do you want this?" She looked at me with disinterest. "I'll take that," she said. Our interaction ended when she took my bag of weed onto the bus. The door closed. "Bye, Fiona," I waved. The bus pulled away. She didn't even thank me, but I'm all right with that. It was really shitty weed. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. We're going to keep the spirit of revelation going. And Jimin, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Vivian. And Minsoo, and Teresa, and HJ, and all the board members. And thank you all for coming. Okay, I'll get to it. All right. I feel really lucky, and this speaks to mine is completely different. I wish I thought of Fiona Apple. Okay, mine's completely different. I feel really lucky to have such good friends. Let me just say one other thing, too. It was a tough kind of challenge to come up with a story, I have to say. You guys are tough. I've been to other readings where they give you a theme and all this stuff. So anyway, it was really tough. All right. So I feel really lucky to have such good friends. Are you guys talking about me? No. Okay, sorry. Okay, it's all right. It's actually about friends. Okay. My teenage daughters always say, "We're so glad you have such good friends, Mom." Code for because you have good friends, it means you have a life. And don't bother us or get too caught up in our lives. To be honest, my kids and I are always talking about friends, their problems with their friends, when they're going to see their friends, times when they've had to make new friends. They have good friends, and in part it's because they've lived in one place most of their lives. In fact, they've really only lived in one house, save my older daughter's first 3 years in a city apartment. It feels like a miracle to me because I was born on the other side of the world and immigrated here when I was 4 years old. My parents moved us a lot in the United States. My bio says I grew up in Rhode Island, Ohio, and New York, but it doesn't say how many houses we lived in each of those states. In Jamestown, New York, from when I was 8 years old until 18, we moved 5 times, 5 different houses in the same town. So it was hard to make friends. It was even harder because we were an immigrant family and there was no internet to help us. As an example, I wore a green Girl Scout outfit to a brownies meeting. The brownies wear brown. Clueless and isolated in a town full of Swedish, mostly Swedish, and Italian Americans who had been there for generations. When I was 9 years old, a friend of my father's family came to visit. They lived 2.5 hours from us. They were also a Korean immigrant family. The father in that family was my father's Dongchan. They had gone to the same school. They were from the same village in the northern part of Korea. The parents talked in the living room while the kids played. They had 3 kids too. The opposite of us though, 2 girls and a boy in the middle. We were 2 boys with a girl in the middle, me. The younger daughter of the other family was my age, and I remember how easy it was to talk with her, easy from the beginning. I remember I wanted to wear the same thing she was wearing, store-bought shorts and a shirt. We didn't have a lot of clothes back then. My mother used to make my dresses, and I was suddenly aware that kids chose their own clothes. My mom died last year, and I would what I'd give for my mom to make my clothes now, actually. Those dresses were really cool, super mod things, and nothing's ever fit me as well since. This family was much more sophisticated than mine. I think the older sister, I can picture her lounging on the bed and reading fashion magazines, while the younger sister and I ran around in the yard and stuff like that. The boys hung out together. They stayed, the whole family stayed 1 or 2 nights, and then they left. Let's skip some of this. So during those years, that family with the 3 kids and mine visited often, going back and forth to each other's towns. In between, the girl who was my age and I wrote letters to each other. We became pen pals. This was before the internet. As we got older, our families visited less and less, but we kept up our letters. I remember thinking how she seemed so much more confident of her future than I was. We sent wallet-sized school pictures back and forth, and I remember looking at her senior year photo and thinking how pretty her makeup and hair were, and how I had no idea how to make myself look as good. I'd never even imagined that eyeshadow was an option for Koreans. There were other Korean families that I would come to know and visit with my family, and they had kids too, but especially this one boy who was my age, and he was really mean to me. But none came even close to my pen pal. We graduated from high school and went to different colleges. She became an engineer, and I became, as my then boyfriend would call it, an arts and leisure person. We lost touch. Maybe blame the boyfriends, but really we were busy finding our way in the world. One day when I was about 24 or 5, my mother, she and my father had moved yet again and followed me to New York. My mother told me that my pen pal had gotten married and that she and her husband were living in Hoboken. She gave me a phone number and I called. It was like no time had passed. We arranged to meet and caught up on all that had happened to our brothers and her sister. The boys had all become doctors or were on their way to becoming doctors. I remember thinking she was just like she was when she was a kid. She hadn't changed. Same warm, fun, thoughtful friend. We've stayed in touch ever since. We went to grad school, she for business, me for writing. She has a brilliant career working for brand names everyone knows. We both have 2 kids. She had hers first, and when she came over with her toddler to visit me after my baby was born, she assured me that the baby would sleep through the night someday. And of all the people who said that to me, she was the one I believed. Throughout the years, she's always asked about my writing and encouraged me to keep at it. It's funny because I think we laughed about a night like this many, many years ago, how we'd celebrate when my book was published. And when she and her husband started Korean American Story, it was inspiring to see them build this incredible organization from talking about it to making it a reality. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna finish reading this. An organization that preserves the stories of Korean Americans, and that's the kind of person my pen pal is. She thinks about it, believes it, makes it happen. So thank you, my dear friend Teresa Cho Lee. We have our party. And I can't wait to eat and all the food, because you know all their parties are the best. Can't wait for what's next for us.
Good evening. I'm standing because I have a reason. Also, Minsoo's standing, so I want to be like him. I want to thank HA and Minsoo for their work here. I believe that feminism is something that we can all be. And I think that our feminism is not words, it's actions. And HA's behavior and Minsoo's behavior and his supporting of our careers is true demonstration of feminism. So I want to thank them. I also want to thank Vivian because I've done this job. It's really hard. When I was asked to come here today, I was really curious because I've been on tour, for those of you who know, for about 1.5 years now. And when I got here, I was thinking, I wanted to come primarily because I was curious. I was like, oh my God, I have never been in a room with that many Korean American women writers. And it's not just here, because Eugenia is here too, and I'm sure there are other writers. And Eugenia's got a terrific book, a knockout book coming out next year. I hope that you get that as well. The reason why I'm standing is because I wasn't born in this country. English is my second language. And when I first came to this country, I had 2 problems. One, I didn't know the language. And 2, I had an incredibly difficult time speaking in public. So I couldn't make friends, not because people weren't nice. People were perfectly nice. I really could not literally make eye contact and talk to people. So it was really difficult. However, the upside of this was that I read everything. Everything. And what ended up happening was that when I went to high school, I decided, after having read everything, that in the West, it's really important that you learn how to talk and you learn how to listen. Because in America and also in Europe, if you don't speak well, people think you're stupid. And I knew that even though I wasn't necessarily the most clever person, that I didn't want to be seen as stupid. And so I decided that I would join the high school debate team. And I want you to know, to go from being completely socially retarded to joining the high school debate team at the Bronx High School of Science. It was an immersion of fire. And it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. I was crying all the time, and I had to disappoint my partner because my partner's like, what the fuck is the matter with you? And then I did that for a whole year, and I said, you know what? For the rest of my life, I know that it was really tough, but I did that for a whole year. And then every summer afterwards, I took a public speaking class, and I learned how to tell a joke in public. I learned how to give speeches, and I learned how to speak without notes. Incredibly difficult. And the most important thing that I realized is that I wanted to not just be seen as stupid, but I realized that I had something to say, not just for me, but for the people that I knew and loved, Koreans. Recently, I was interviewed by the Japan Times, and they asked me, and it was very interesting because the person who interviewed me was a European journalist who was doing freelance work, and he asked me, so tell me, if you can, what are Koreans like? And I took the bait. And I said, we like to dance. We like to sing. We would fall on a sword for our countrymen, and we would fall on a sword for our friends, because Koreans are loyal. And he looked at me in surprise, as if this was an incredibly weird thing to say. And then I realized that it's so important that we go around and we keep talking and we keep sharing and we keep writing about Koreans, because people don't know. Well, tonight we have a testament of many amazing writers with whom I share the stage, that Koreans are so variegated, diverse, interesting, have an incredible point of view. And I really hope that each one of you feels seen, loved, collected, and admired, because that is exactly how I feel. Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and stand as well, because I'm not confident I can hold my pages and flip and hold the mic at the same time. So, I told my mom, who is here with my dad and my husband in this audience, that there was going to be a quick and gentle joke about her in the beginning. Gentle. And I'm also going to say, this is such a luxury for me, because my book came out in February, and since then, Minsoo was talking about mansplaining. Since then, I feel like I've been Korea-splaining. And so since we have a room full of Koreans here today and Korean Americans, I'm going to talk about Italy, because I can. So I will tell you that I have flat feet. When I walk across a room, after I take a shower, you can see the footprint of my entire foot. So like normally you would see a space where people's arches are. You see my whole foot. I was so bad at gym class that my teacher once yelled in my face, "Try, you're not even trying." I was trying really hard. I once fell off a beam that was mounted several inches off the ground because I was so intent on holding the rope, because you were supposed to hold the rope as you cross the beam. I fell in a straight line because this is how uncoordinated I am. I didn't realize I was falling until I hit my head on the ground. And the high school, I'm sure you're all imagining like preschool tumbling in your mind. It was high school. Sent me home because they thought I was concussed. So my mom, this is where the joke is, she would say to me, "Eugen, when you run, you look like you're leaning backwards." She said, "Lean forward. You're supposed to be moving forward." By the way, my mom is who I inherited my lack of coordination from. So I feel like this was like a pity on her part. She was like, "Oh, my dear daughter, what have I done to you?" So I've been thinking a lot about forward movement lately because of what's going on in our government. And so many things are moving forward that clearly should not be moving forward. And all the things that we think we are doing to track forward movement, I've been thinking about it because sometimes you think you're leaning backwards, but you're still moving forward. Sometimes you're trying really hard and you're not making a lot of visible progress. Sometimes slow isn't worse than fast. Some of the best things that happened in my life happened so slow, like my writing or my child, that I thought it would never happen at all. But when I think of all my favorite pieces of art or literature, it took a long time, and I wouldn't want any of it to have happened 1 minute sooner, because maybe it would have been less revelatory, maybe it would have been less brilliant, and it's always, always worth the wait. In 2012, a chef friend of mine told me she's going to a food festival in Turin, Italy. She asked if I wanted to join her, and she said a bunch of things about the slow food movement, sustainability, prosciutto, and I was like, say no more. Like, I am coming with you to this trip. So I landed on Wednesday, and we were set to come back to New York on Sunday, and it turned out what I was attending was something called the Terra Madre Salone de Gusto. As you can tell, I picked up a very authentic Italian accent. So it's hosted in Turin every other fall and showcases specialty foods from 160 different countries. So Terra Madre is the Italian group that's in the network of Slow Food. And Slow Food, to quote from their website, I'm just going to give you a little bit of information because it's fun. It's a global grassroots organization founded in 1989 to prevent the disappearance of local food cultures and traditions, counteract the rise of fast life, and combat people's dwindling interest in the food that they eat, where it comes from, and how our food choices affect the world around us. Since its beginning, Slow Food has grown into a global movement involving millions of people in 160 countries, working to ensure everyone has access to good, clean, fair food. So it's a really cool organization. It does vital work. But even if you didn't care about all of that, what you might want to take home from this is that they throw the best festival in Turin every other year. So I had no idea what I was in store for. So if I tell you for 3 days, I did not leave the convention center. Seeing relatively little of Turin, which is an ancient city that claims Shroud of Jesus, did not care. Not caring about the Shroud of Jesus. Would you be less appalled if I told you that the convention center was a converted Fiat factory, really cool building, massive, unlike the cars, haha, airy and modern, and packed with stalls and exhibits and workshops and lectures by Italian winemakers, Korean Buddhist monks on temple cuisine, coffee experts, and food celebrities like Alice Waters. So the Fiat factory was like a delicious UN of food, only with far less bickering and infinitely more prosciutto. I am not exaggerating when I tell you there were literal walls of prosciutto. Not like Lady Gaga's dress, not like slices of prosciutto draped artfully on the walls, but literally like hams of prosciutto mounted in like a grid. And then the best specimens were modeled on the table as if it were this like priceless violin, and they would like cut you slices. And so I'm telling my husband about this, he's in the audience, and I'm like, and it was like a priceless violin. He's like, oh, are you talking about how in Spain, like if you want to like have prosciutto, you go to the bartender and you say, can you play the violin? And I was like, what? I thought I made up this beautiful metaphor about like the prosciutto and the violin. Apparently it's a common thing to ask in Spain. So I learned about prosciutto. I learned about coffee. Does anybody here know who discovered coffee? Ethiopian goats discovered coffee. So apparently goat herds ranging became curious when they noticed that goats were becoming very enthusiastic after they ate some berries. And so they decided, well, why don't we eat some of these berries and see what happens to us? I'm telling this story because what happened in all of these wonderful experiences in Turin is that I also found out that South Korea, which is where I was born, and spent 6 years of my life, slots in really nicely with the slow food movement and also the slow city movement, which really surprised me because a story that I knew about Korea was pali, 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 you know? Fast, 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 fast. You know, we're progressing so fast. We're doing everything faster than everybody else. You know, my parents, they moved to Korea around 2013 for 3 years, and they would call me up and they would say, Korea is so much better than the United States. You have no idea. Like, we moved there and we called up the cable company. In 45 minutes, they were here. They set up our cable and internet. They were like, do you know how long it takes to get cable to come to your house in New Jersey? 2 weeks. So anyway, but it was such a surprise to me that I think among 117 designated slow cities in the world, South Korea, which is the size of Indiana, has 8 of them out of 117. And I shouldn't have been surprised because for all the years that I grew up in New Jersey before I went to college, I ate Korean food every day. I know how long it takes to make that panchan. I know how long it takes to make, you know, the little mandus where you have to like crimp the edges. I know how long it takes to make kimchi, which like fermented products is literally a product of time. But it took me going all the way to Italy, where I had never been before, to realize that this was a part of my food heritage. So it seemed to me kind of magical and lovely that I had gone all the way to Italy to find out something that was so elemental. And it reminded me of my grandmother. So my grandmother, when we were in elementary school, she would like make my mom stop the car and be like, I see patches of wild garlic over there, or I see patches of like souk over there. And so she would forage and make panchan for us. And 30 years ago in suburban New Jersey, like she knew what was up. Whereas like now, if I wanted to eat something like foraged and esoteric, I would have to be like the chump that goes to a famous restaurant and pays a lot of money for somebody else to forage for it. So the unexpected pleasures of this trip, celebrating the slowness of food and the old traditions around the world, it probably resonated with me so much because this is what I do as a writer and a reader. What we do is slow, built on a long tradition of people who have labored and nourished themselves and others with the art of making something necessary and beautiful. Sure, some innovations are really useful, like I'm very glad that I can use a cursor to move text around, because Jane Austen used to have to like cut pages and like pin them together with sewing pins, and I'm not about that. I don't like that idea. But the essential stuff of reading and writing and storytelling, the stuff that necessarily takes time, that hasn't changed so much. I'm so proud to be a part of this tradition, this way of life. It occurs to me that writers and artisans are the drag, not a drag, the resistance that keeps society from hurtling forward, being too aerodynamic. Sometimes it's going slow, the speed of your feet, especially if you have flat feet like me, your hands, your mind, questioning, mulling it over, that manifests the most progress. This stage is, I probably could not have imagined this stage when I was a little girl looking for Korean American writers to read in the library. Like I used to literally go to the library and look under Kim and Lee and Park and you and like look and Cho and Chang be like, where are the books? And now, like Minsoo said, you could take 2 months off and read all our books, and then there would be more. Eugenia's book coming out next year, and it's like a dream. So as a reader, I'm so grateful for everyone on this stage, because through their writing, they articulated something that felt familiar to me, that I might have taken for granted or not bothered to examine. They showed me, too, the diversity of Korean American identity and narrative, how there's always more to see and hear and think about, how even if you think you've heard it all or seen it all about Koreans and Korean Americans, there's so many more stories left to tell. Super exciting. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Well, this is a hard group to go at the end of. It's like gym class. All right. So Vivian already mentioned to you that I grew up in North Dakota, and you all made that noise, so you know. Growing up in North Dakota, my favorite TV show was The Love Boat, right? Oh, good. So you know it. For those of you who are too young to remember, The Love Boat was an hour-long series that ran on ABC from the late 70s to the mid-80s, and it was basically a rotating weekly cast of sort of B and C-list celebrities who would play passengers on a cruise ship. What I didn't know at the time was that the Love Boat was a real ship. In addition to serving as the film set for the series, it also sailed around the world taking real people to different ports of call. I learned this in my 20s because my now former mother-in-law was obsessed with the Love Boat, the series. She also really loved cruising. So much so that when Princess Cruise Lines, which owned and operated the Love Boat, announced that it was taking the Love Boat out of its global fleet and retiring the ship, she promptly booked passage for 4 on one of the final sails of the Love Boat. So at the time, I lived in Brooklyn, and I was married, and I had one of those jobs that I think it made my parents back in North Dakota really proud to be able to talk to their friends about. But I didn't love my work, not by any stretch of the imagination. I kind of fell into it, and I did it, you know, looking back, I can honestly say I did it because of the money, you know? But I had to work really hard to make that money, and it didn't leave a lot of time for much of anything. Definitely not reading, definitely not writing. And as a result, my ex and I, we didn't take vacations. And if we were to plan a vacation, we are not the target demographic for the Love Boat. But, you know, this was a stage of my life where I feel like some decisions were like sort of easier to make when they were made for me. And we figured, you know, tickets bought and paid for, so we might as well go on this cruise. So the second to the last voyage of the Love Boat was a 7-day sail. It was supposed to go to Bermuda, and it was scheduled to leave the port of Boston on Saturday, September 15th, 2001. Yeah. And, you know, I grew up in North Dakota, where there weren't a lot of us in my hometown. There weren't people of color. There wasn't any diversity, so my family was kind of it. And I spent my childhood and my adolescence feeling very, very alone. I think because of that, from a very young age, I dreamed of living in New York City. I dreamed of moving here as soon as I possibly could. It meant a lot to me to live here. I thought quite rightfully assumed that given the events of September 11th, there was absolutely no way we were getting on the Love Boat and sailing off to Bermuda. That seemed insane to me. I thought that we were going to stay home and grieve with everyone else for what had happened to our city, what had happened to our country. But people grieve in different ways. And for my in-laws and for my ex, their way was to get as far away from New York as we possibly could. So I was overruled, and you know, I've only told this story like once in person because this is such a strange thing to say. On September 15th, 2001, I boarded the Love Boat and I sailed off to Bermuda. I did that. I really did that. And I carried with me 2 suitcases. One was filled with clothes. It was like a really badly packed bag that I think was like reflective of my mental state. I had like dresses, shirts, no shorts, no sandals, and like 1 flip-flop. Like that's all I had. Like that was my clothing. And then the other bag that I had was completely filled with books, like more books than any human being could possibly read in 1 week's time. But I brought them. And I'm gonna come back to that bag in a second, but just something that I didn't know about cruise lines, because this was my first, who knew? But cruise ships cost hundreds of millions of dollars. So by the time a company like Princess decides to take one out of its fleet, it's like decades too late. The Love Boat was just so old, so faded. Like one of my creative writing students would say like it had like pizzazz, and that's exactly right. Like it was a surreal physical environment to be in so soon after 9/11. In addition to the fact that it was a ghost ship. Nobody would ever tell me the number or the percentage, but I'm willing to guess like 30 to 40% of the people who were supposed to be on this ship just wisely chose to exercise their travel insurance and stay home. So the people who did show up were very much like my family. Like they just wanted to forget. And the crew, God bless them, like they were more than happy to oblige. So like little things like we were supposed to get a newspaper every day. There was no newspaper. We never had any news. The TVs in the staterooms and in the lounges didn't work. It was like someone had pulled a plug somewhere. This was 2001, so no internet, no smartphones. We were literally floating out at sea with no news from home, which given what had happened, like that was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. So, you know, I did the only thing that I could figure out to do in that moment of time. I took that bag of books and I went to an upper deck by myself and I read from first light until well after dusk every single day. That's all I could do. And one of the books that I read during that time period was Sophie's Choice by William Styron. Yeah, I know. And not to give anything away. Not to give anything away. But those are the last lines of that book, like, are some of the best lines I have ever read. This was not Judgment Day, only morning, excellent and fair. Like, I read those lines, I lost it. And I know I lost it for a lot of reasons, but I lost it. And I remember thinking that for most of my life, even if a book made me incredibly sad like Sophie's Choice did, like I was at my happiest with a book in my hands. I was at my happiest thinking about a book that I wanted to write. And even when it was scary, I was at my happiest when I was like sitting down with a pen and paper and actually trying to write a book. And somewhere along the way, somewhere during this trip, it occurred to me that I had spent so much of my life up until that point working really, really hard trying to make other people proud, when all my parents had ever asked of me, was just be happy. Somewhere along the way, I had completely confused the two things. 10 months after the Love Boat, I had quit my job, I had sold my apartment, I had extricated from a marriage that hadn't been working for a long time. I had applied and gotten into an MFA program, and I had started taking those really small baby steps toward trying to become the writer that I had always wanted to be. It's really hard. It's really hard, and it's a really, really happy life. Thank you.